Welcome. Today, we're really getting into something fascinating. We're looking at the very beginnings of forensic psychology, specifically how the FBI developed this incredible ability to look at a crime scene, just the evidence left behind, the behavior, and, well, build a picture of the person responsible. We're talking about the real story, not the Hollywood version, of criminal personality profiling. And for this, our main source is a really seminal text. Excerpts from inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit. It's by the agent who basically invented this field, John Douglas, along with Mark Olshaker. Douglas is, legendary. His work really defined criminal profiling as we know it today, influencing law enforcement all over the world.
Absolutely. And our goal here, for you listening, is to really explore those core ideas that Douglas and his colleagues hammered out. We want to dive into the psychology of these, violent offenders, look at the actual techniques they created to catch them, and also, importantly, touch on the immense personal toll this kind of work takes. Staring into that darkness, it costs them.
Okay, right. So let's start at the beginning. Before the FBI made it official, this whole idea of profiling, it was mostly just, fiction, wasn't it? Like Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly. Yeah, you had characters like Holmes using deduction, looking at behavior, but turning that into a real forensic tool, that didn't really happen until the mid-1950s. And the case that really forced everyone to pay attention was the mad bomber in New York City, George Metesky.
He planted bombs for years, didn't he?
He did. Over 30 bombs across 15 years, hit places like Grand Central. And because it was so spread out, so random seeming, standard police work just wasn't getting anywhere. They needed something different. That's when they brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. James A. Brussel.
And Brussel did something completely new, didn't he? He looked at the crimes to figure out the criminal, kind of flipped the usual approach on its head.
Precisely. Instead of working from the person outward, he worked from the evidence inward. He analyzed the patterns and the bombings where Metesky hit, the way the devices were made, all these behavioral clues. He used that consistency to build a profile of the unknown subject's personality. It wasn't about interviews or witnesses. It was like diagnosing an illness purely from its symptoms, the symptoms being the crimes themselves.
Okay, and the predictions he made were, they were startlingly specific.
Uncannily so. That's what made it historic. He predicted Metesky would be single, probably middle-aged, hold a deep grudge, likely against Con Edison. He said he'd be foreign-born or have foreign parents, living probably in Connecticut, and living with an older female relative like a sister or an aunt.
Wow.
And the detail that everyone remembers. Brussel predicted that when they caught him, he'd be wearing a buttoned-up, double-breasted suit. Very neat, very proper.
And was he?
Spot on. They found Metesky exactly where Brussel said, living with his unmarried sisters in Waterbury, Connecticut. And when they arrested him, there he was, wearing that double-breasted suit, all buttoned up.
That must have sent shockwaves through law enforcement, the sheer accuracy of it.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking, that potential, eventually it started to seep into the FBI Academy at Quantico.
Even though the FBI, particularly under Hoover and even after, wasn't exactly keen on psychology, the soft sciences.
Not at all. The Bureau valued hard facts, procedure, evidence you could touch. Psychology seemed fuzzy, unreliable. But the Metesky case was hard to ignore.
So how did it actually get a foothold inside Quantico?
It really started with a couple of key instructors in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
Howard Teton, who'd been a Marine, and Patrick Mullaney. They were crucial. Teton was so impressed by the Mad Bomber profile that he actually went to New York, found Dr. Brussel, and basically convinced Brussel to teach him his methods directly.
So he brought that knowledge directly into the FBI.
Yes. And that allowed them to start weaving these ideas into an applied criminology course, kicking off around 1977. That was the real start.
And this is where the unit formally begins, right? And the book mentions one of their first big contributions was actually just standardizing the language.
That's right. Douglas and the team realized they needed a common vocabulary. And the most famous term to come out of that was UNSUB, the unknown subject.
UNSUB. Yeah, you hear that all the time in crime shows now.
Exactly. But back then, it was important. It framed the perpetrator not as an unknowable phantom, but as an individual whose identity could be systematically figured out through their actions. And the core principle they hammered home was incredibly simple, yet revolutionary for the time. Behavior reflects personality.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
It means that everything an offender does at the crime scene, how they kill, if they overkill, if they stage things, where they commit the crime relative to where they live, all of it tells you something about who they are. The profilers learned to read those details like a doctor reads symptoms. Each action is a clue pointing towards the killer's mindset, their habits, their lifestyle, even their job sometimes. It's all interconnected.
That makes a lot of sense. But you mentioned the FBI's skepticism toward psychology. How did Douglas keep this new unit from getting shut down or sidelined?
Oh, the skepticism was huge. Douglas talks about how psychology was often dismissed internally as, well, worthless bullshit, his words, academic, impractical.
Right.
He knew they had to prove their worth fast, so he made a very smart strategic move. He changed the unit's name. It started as the Behavioral Science Unit, or BSU.
BSU. Okay.
Douglas changed it to the Investigative Support Unit,
Yeah.
ISU.
Investigative support. That sounds much more practical, less academic.
Precisely. It wasn't just a name change, it was a branding exercise. By emphasizing support, he positioned the unit as providing concrete help to agents in the field. Actionable intelligence, not just theories. He wanted to ditch the BS perception, focus on results, and show the old guard how this soft science could actually help them catch bad guys. And it worked. It gained them respect. Grudgingly at first, but respect nonetheless.
But that success, that demand for their expertise, it came at a staggering cost, didn't it? The book paints a picture of just relentless pressure, especially on Douglas.
The workload was crushing. Douglas mentions being on the road away from Quantico about 125 days a year on average, just constant travel, case after case.
And the requests were just pouring in.
Nonstop, from police departments everywhere. He even jokes grimly that colleagues called him a male whore because he just couldn't bring himself to say no to a request for help.
Why couldn't he say no?
Empathy, mostly. A massive sense of responsibility. He knew that every case he turned down meant a family potentially left without answers, a dangerous person still out there, and hanging over everything was this terrifying knowledge. If he got a profile wrong, if his opinion was off, it could send an investigation completely down the wrong path.
Right.
It could literally get more people killed.
That kind of pressure, constant high-stakes decisions, bouncing between horrific cases across the country, it's almost unimaginable.
Yeah, the book describes these grueling trips, like flying from a complex case in Alaska straight across multiple time zones down to Seattle for another urgent consult, often within just a day or two. That kind of relentless stress, it builds up, it takes a physical toll.
And it culminated in that really frightening incident in Seattle in December 1983, his physical collapse.
Yes, he was in Seattle consulting on a major case, and he just started feeling incredibly ill. Intense headache, nausea, like a really bad flu he couldn't shake. He told his colleagues who were with him, Blaine McKilwen and Ron Walker, that he just needed to rest for a day. But when he didn't show up for breakfast the next morning, they knew something was wrong. Seriously wrong.
What did they find?
They had to kick his hotel room door in. It was chain locked. They found him on the floor, sort of curled up in what the book calls a frog-like position.
Oh.
He was convulsing, had a raging fever, totally unresponsive.
Oh my God.
They got him to Swedish hospital immediately. The diagnosis came back, viral encephalitis. It's a brain infection. And the doctors were clear. It was either directly caused by or massively worsened by the incredible sustained stress he'd been under.
And the outlook the doctors gave his family? It was bleak, wasn't it?
Utterly devastating. A CNS scan showed the right side of his brain had actually ruptured and hemorrhaged. They were very blunt with his wife, Pam. They told her he was probably going to die. They apparently used the phrase that his brain had been fried to a crisp. And even if, by some miracle, he survived, the likely outcomes were blindness, being vegetative, or suffering massive permanent brain damage.
Just awful.
His colleagues, though, they really rallied. They basically formed a support network right there in Seattle. Stayed with him 24/7, took up collections so his wife and father could stay there. At one point, they were actually making arrangements to fly his body back home for burial. He was in a coma for a week.
But he did pull through. The recovery, though, it sounds like it was incredibly difficult, and it left him with a lot of anger towards the FBI.
Yeah, when he finally came out of the coma, he was in a bad way. Very confused. He had trouble speaking clearly. His speech was slurred for a long time. His entire left side was paralyzed, and he had serious memory gaps. He had to go through intense physical therapy just to learn basic things again, like walking. It was a long, hard road back.
Bitterness. Where did that come from?
It came from feeling abandoned by the Bureau. He specifically remembered warning FBI management just months earlier, the previous February, that the pace was unsustainable. He told them he desperately needed more people, more resources for the unit. He couldn't keep going like that.
And they didn't listen.
The response he got basically confirmed his fears about the institutional culture. The assistant director, Jim McKenzie, was sympathetic personally, but he laid out the reality of the Bureau. You know this organization. You have to do something until you drop before anyone will recognize it.
Wow. So basically, we won't help you until you collapse.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
And Douglas felt particularly betrayed because he'd also been officially reprimanded earlier for being too candid with the media about the Atlanta child murders investigation. So it felt like punishment followed by neglect.
And that anger, that resentment, it led to a pretty dramatic act described in the book.
It really did. About a month after he got home from the hospital, still recovering, still furious, he went out to his backyard to burn some leaves. And on impulse, fueled by all that bitterness about the personal cost versus the lack of institutional support, he just started grabbing stuff from the house. Every copy of every profile he'd written, articles about his work, case files, basically the entire paper trail of his career.
And he burned it.
Threw it all in the bonfire.
Yeah.
He said he was trying to just erase it all, erase what the job had done to him. It's a really visceral act of purging.
That speaks volumes about how broken he must have felt. But there was a moment of connection later when he went back to Quantico.
Yes, that's a really poignant part of the story. He made his first trip back to the academy in April 1984. He was still pretty frail, even had to wear slippers because his feet were swollen from blood clots. He was there to speak to a group of about 50 profilers who'd gathered from all over. And when he walked in, they gave him this huge, spontaneous standing ovation. And Douglas writes that in that moment, surrounded by the people who actually understood the work, the risks, the importance of it, he finally felt like he belonged again. He felt cherished and appreciated, like coming home.
That's quite a journey. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. After Douglas recovered and got back to work, what did all those years of interviewing killers, analyzing crime scenes? What did it teach them about the core motivation behind these terrible crimes?
Well, after talking to dozens of these guys, the most violent offenders imaginable, a central theme emerged. It wasn't really just about sex or even just hatred, though those could be components. Fundamentally, the driving force was domination and control.
Domination and control.
Yeah. The crime itself, the violence, it was the means to achieve absolute power over another person, the power to decide if they live or die, the power to dictate every aspect of their suffering. Douglas explains that the profiler has to, in a way, get inside that mindset to understand the fantasy being played out. The real thrill for many of these offenders wasn't just the killing, it was maximizing the victim's terror and pain.
Prolonging it.
Often, yes. Keeping them alive longer, sometimes even reviving them if they lost consciousness, just to extend that period of total control. And Douglas noted that if a victim broke down, cried, pleaded, maybe called out for mommy or daddy, that regression actually fueled the killer's fantasy of ultimate power. It energized the act for them.
Understanding that need for control must have been key to developing effective interrogation strategies, like the DeVere case you mentioned earlier and the rock technique.
Exactly. That case, the murder of 12-year-old Mary Frances Stoner, was tough. The main suspect, DeVere, had already beaten a polygraph. He felt untouchable. Douglas knew they couldn't crack him with just facts or direct questions. They needed a psychological approach to exploit his guilt.
So how did they set it up?
Douglas gave the investigators really precise instructions for staging the interrogation. First, do it at night. People are generally more vulnerable then, less defensive. Plus, if they broke him, he'd be exhausted, less likely to recant later. Second, show a united front. FBI, local police, prosecutors, everyone involved right there in the room. It sends a message. The entire system is focused on you. Third, props. Pile up stacks of folders on the table in front of him, all labeled with his name. They were mostly empty, but the visual suggestion was overwhelming evidence.
Creating an illusion of inevitability, but the core of it was the rock itself.
That was the masterstroke. The murder weapon was a rock stained with blood. Douglas told them, put that rock on a small table, clearly visible, but at about a 45-degree angle to DeVere's line of sight.
Why?
So he couldn't ignore it, but it wasn't directly confrontational either. And the crucial rule, nobody mentions the rock. Don't ask about it, don't refer to it, just let it sit there.
So the observation was key.
Totally. The investigators were told to watch him closely for tiny nonverbal cues as breathing, any sweat, subtle shifts in posture, and especially the pulse in his neck, the carotid artery. Douglas reasoned that if DeVere was guilty, the physical presence of the rock, the actual instrument of his crime, would be an unavoidable psychological trigger. He couldn't not react to it internally, even if he tried to stay stoic. His body would betray him.
And did it.
It did. DeVere couldn't keep his composure. The constant visual reminder of his guilt sitting right there, it wore him down. He eventually broke and confessed, and Douglas drew a universal lesson from it. Everybody has a rock, meaning every offender has some internal point of guilt, some hidden piece of the crime in their memory that if you can just find it and trigger it correctly, it can unlock everything.
That's fascinating, applying behavioral insights right into the interrogation room. Let's look at the different types of offenders Douglas studied. The book uses Ed Kemper and Jerry Brudos as key examples.
Right, Kemper, the co-ed killer, is almost a textbook example of what Douglas called the manufactured killer. His crimes were horrific, killing co-eds, then his own mother, dismemberment. But the analysis showed it was all deeply rooted in this incredible rage he had towards his mother, who was apparently very dominant and abusive.
So the murders were symbolic.
In a way, yes, it was seen as him trying to get back at dear old mom, psychologically speaking. The victims often resembled her or represented that dominant female figure he hated. And Kemper showed many classic warning signs early on, this so-called homicidal triad. Chronic bedwetting well past childhood, setting fires, cruelty to animals. The fact that his spree ended almost immediately after he killed his mother seemed to confirm she was the central focus of his rage.
Then there's Jerry Brudos. His story seems to illustrate how these things can escalate over time.
Absolutely. Brudos' case is really important for understanding that progression, that refinement of fantasy. It started seemingly small, almost quirky, finding women's high heels in a junkyard and keeping them.
Just shoes.
Initially. But then it grew. He started collecting shoes obsessively, then breaking into empty houses just to handle women's clothing, maybe stage little scenes, then stalking women, and eventually abduction, murder, and very specific ritualistic mutilation.
Like removing a foot.
Yes, and making plastic molds of victims' breasts. The book highlights this sinister refinement of his fantasy. It wasn't static, it grew more complex, more demanding over time. And for profilers, seeing that kind of behavioral escalation is a much stronger clue to the offender's psychology than anything they might say in an interview. It shows a deep-seated obsession that's constantly evolving.
It's chilling. Let's move to another type, the hunter. The Robert Hansen case in Alaska seems to fit that perfectly. He seemed like a normal guy, right? Baker, family man.
On the surface, yes. Respected member of the Anchorage community. But secretly, he was abducting prostitutes, flying them out to remote cabins in the wilderness, and then hunting them down like animals. Literally. Douglas saw an immediate parallel to that classic story, The Most Dangerous Game. Hansen was an accomplished big game hunter. He'd hunted bear, elk, everything Alaska had to offer. Douglas believed he just got bored, so he moved on to human prey. And he targeted prostitutes specifically because, in his view, they were lower than myself, disposable, less likely to be missed. He dehumanized them completely.
And the profile suggested the hunt was the main thing for him.
Exactly. The stalking, the tracking, giving them that false sense of hope, a chance to run before inevitably catching them. That was the thrill. The actual killing, according to the profile and later confirmed by Hansen, was often almost anticlimactic, just the end of the game.
Well, didn't the profile predict something specific about his speech?
Yes, this was a really insightful part. Douglas profiled that Hansen likely had a significant speech impediment, probably a stutter. But crucially, he predicted this stutter would completely disappear the moment Hansen felt dominant, in control during the hunt.
And was that true?
Investigators confirmed it. Hansen had a noticeable stutter in everyday life. But when he was in his hunter mode, exerting power over his victims, it vanished. It perfectly illustrated how central that need for control was to his entire being.
That need for control also plays into another key concept, staging. When the killer tries to mislead investigators because they know the victim.
Right. Staging is a huge red flag for profilers. Usually means the offender isn't a stranger, they have some connection to the victim, and are trying to throw suspicion elsewhere, often faking a burglary or a random attack. The Elizabeth Jane Wolshaker case in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, is a classic example discussed in the book.
The dentist's wife.
That's the one. Dr. Wolshaker claimed an intruder broke in, knocked him out, went upstairs, and killed his wife, Betty. But the scene just didn't add up. First, nothing was stolen. Odd for a burglary. Second, the house lights were off, suggesting the intruder knew the routine, knew when people would likely be asleep or resting. Third, and very importantly, the cause of death. Manual strangulation. That's a very hands-on, personal, violent way to kill. It takes time, effort, close contact. Very rare for a typical burglar or random attacker.
So the method itself pointed away from a stranger. What else seemed off?
The behavior of the husband and his brother Neil, who showed up very quickly. Think about it. If you genuinely wake up to find your spouse murdered, your reaction is going to be shock, panic, frantic concern, especially if there are children in the house.
Right.
Dr. Wolshaker claimed he was unconscious for a bit. But neither he nor his brother immediately rushed upstairs to check on Betty or on their young daughter Danielle, who was also asleep upstairs. That lack of immediate desperate concern just didn't fit the expected behavior of innocent victims in that scenario. Plus, the supposed entry point, a second-story window, didn't make sense with the husband being attacked downstairs first. Why wouldn't the intruder check the upstairs rooms?
Too many inconsistencies.
Exactly. All those contradictions, combined with the intimate method of killing, strongly suggested it wasn't a random attack. It pointed towards a personal motive, someone known to the victim trying to stage a cover-up. The flaws in the staging revealed the personality behind it.
As Douglas and the team got deeper into these minds, they inevitably ran up against complex issues like insanity, manipulation.
Yes, and Douglas is very clear on one point. Insanity is a legal term, not a psychiatric one. It's about whether the person understood right from wrong at the time of the crime.
Not about whether they have a mental illness generally.
Correct. And he found that many serial offenders are incredibly manipulative. They become very skilled at fooling people, psychiatrists, parole boards, lawyers, offered by playing on this confusion between legal insanity and mental illness. The Thomas Vanda case is a chilling example of this. Vanda was in treatment, and a psychiatrist was insisting he was making progress, maybe even ready for release consideration.
But the psychiatrist hadn't looked at the crime details.
He refused to, said it would bias his therapeutic relationship. Douglas saw this as incredibly dangerous naivete, allowing Vanda to manipulate the situation. So Douglas basically cornered the doctor and forced him to listen to the graphic reality of Vanda's crime. How he'd propositioned a young woman, attacked her when rejected, stabbed her repeatedly, and then committed necrophilia with her corpse.
He wanted to shock the doctor into seeing the real Vanda.
Precisely. Douglas's point, quite bluntly put to the doctor, was, "You're going to recommend this guy might be freed, and you don't even know who the hell you're dealing with." The broader lesson was that dangerousness is often situational. An offender like Vanda, or Arthur Shawcross, can seem perfectly fine, even charming, within the structured, controlled environment of an institution. They learn to say the right things, follow the rules.
But that doesn't mean they're cured.
Not at all. Put them back out in the world with freedom, stress, opportunity, access to potential victims. And the underlying dangerous personality often reemerges. Shawcross himself basically admitted he understood this, hoping for an insanity plea because time in a mental hospital seemed easier than prison. Manipulating the system was part of the profile.
Despite all the breakthroughs, some cases remained unsolved for a long time. The dragons that won, as Douglas puts it, like Green River, BTK. What did he think happened when prolific killers just stopped?
His conclusion, generally, wasn't that they found peace or got cured. It was usually more practical. Either they got scared, maybe they sensed law enforcement was getting too close, had a near miss, or quite often they simply got arrested and jailed for something else entirely.
A lesser crime.
Yeah, a burglary, assault, something unrelated that effectively took them off the streets, even if the police didn't realize they caught the serial killer. It acts like an accidental holding pattern. With Green River, for instance, despite the massive effort, the book acknowledges that sometimes the science, the resources, they were just too little too late to prevent more tragedies.
And the work itself, it clearly took a toll on the profilers. You mentioned the stress leading to Douglas's collapse, but there's also a kind of emotional numbing, isn't there?
A profound desensitization, yes. Being constantly immersed in the absolute worst aspects of human behavior, it inevitably changes your perspective. Douglas talks about finding it hard to relate to everyday mundane concerns.
Because his baseline for bad was so extreme.
Exactly. Socializing outside of work became difficult. What seemed like a big deal to other people just didn't register the same way after dealing with serial murder day in and day out. He tells this really telling, kind of disturbing story. His wife cut her hand badly in the kitchen once, lots of blood, screaming. Everyone rushes in, panicked.
And Douglas.
His first, almost automatic thought. He found the blood spatter pattern interesting. He started mentally analyzing it, comparing it to patterns he'd seen at crime scenes. He tried to make a dark joke to lighten the mood, but he admits his reaction was disturbingly clinical compared to everyone else's. It showed how much the horror had become normalized for him.
That's a stark illustration of the cost. So looking back at everything, the cases, the interviews, the personal sacrifice was the big takeaway. The core conclusion Douglas reached after all those years.
The single most consistent finding, cutting across almost all the cases, was that violent predators are overwhelmingly made, not born.
Made, not born.
Yeah. Douglas emphasizes that in all his experience, he never encountered a single predatory serial killer who came from what you'd call a truly loving, stable, supportive family background. Never.
So things like childhood abuse, neglect, dysfunction, those are the breeding grounds, like with Kemper's rage against his mother or Brudos' isolation.
Those environmental factors seem to be the critical ingredients. Profound negative influences, abuse, abandonment, lack of empathy modeled for them appear to be the manufacturing components for these kinds of individuals. Now, Douglas is clear. This doesn't excuse their choices. They are responsible, they deserve punishment. But he argues that if we understand how they are made, then maybe we can think differently about prevention.
Beyond just catching them after the fact.
Right. If a profound negative influence helps create a killer, maybe a profound positive influence, applied early enough, could prevent one from developing in the first place.
So the implication is society has a role to play, not just in punishment, but in prevention, by addressing those root causes.
That seems to be the deeper conclusion. Profiling helps us catch them faster, protect potential victims now. But the long-term solution, if there is one, might lie in addressing the societal conditions, the family dysfunction, the lack of support systems that allow these individuals to be manufactured. It's almost paradoxical, but after decades spent studying unimaginable darkness, Douglas's final thought in the source material isn't just about needing more police or prisons, though he acknowledges those are necessary. It's that fundamentally, what we most need more of is love.
A powerful thought indeed, coming from someone who spent his life looking evil in the eye.